My grandparents' place was on the northern edge of Ridgefield Valley, way out on a little patch of grass that felt like it was the only open space for miles. From the porch, you could feel the woods pressing in from every direction. As a child, I found that comforting, like nothing could get through all those trees unless my grandfather allowed it. He was the kind of person who always knew exactly what was happening on his land. If a branch cracked at the property's edge, he'd look up from his coffee and nod, as if he'd expected it. Back then, I believed nothing could surprise him. I think that made me feel braver. It's strange how quickly that feeling of safety can vanish. After they were gone, my grandfather first, then my grandmother a few years later, nobody was left to look after the place, except for me. And I kept putting it off, pretending it wasn't my responsibility until the legal paperwork forced me to face it. Last October, I finally drove back out there. I hadn't been near that house in 15 years. I thought maybe it would look the same, but as I got closer, I started to realize just how long it had truly been. The main road turned to gravel, then narrowed into a path that was basically just packed dirt with deep ruts on either side. My little sedan felt ridiculously out of place. I kept carefully guiding the tires onto the middle ridge so I wouldn't hit the rocks hard. It was so quiet out there. No cars, no houses, not even power lines. I remember thinking, it's only 3 nights. That was the deal I made with myself. 3 nights to go through the rooms, decide what to keep, and meet the notary to sign off on selling the land. Then I could go back to my real life in the city and forget all about it. By the time I pulled into the clearing, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. The porch looked worse than I expected. Boards were sagging so low they nearly brushed the dirt. One plank was rotted right through, so I had to step carefully around it to reach the door. When I pressed my palm against the lock, it turned so easily it made my stomach lurch, as if no time had passed at all, like the house had been sitting there waiting for me. Inside, the smell hit me first. Old wood, mothballs, and something else. Something sour and damp, like wet leaves left to rot in a pile. It brought back this wave of memories I wasn't ready for. The holidays spent here, the sound of my grandmother humming in the kitchen, my grandfather's heavy boots by the back door. I stood there for a minute, taking it all in, feeling like I'd stepped into some kind of preserved version of my childhood. Then I placed my bag by the stairs and began opening cabinets. Most of the dishes were still there, stacked neatly behind yellowed contact paper. A stack of newspapers sat on the counter, 2 years old and curling at the edges. My grandmother's knitting basket was under her chair, with that half-finished scarf she'd been working on. The needles were still stuck right where she left them, the yarn a little faded. By the time it got fully dark, I'd managed to box up the kitchen and part of the living room. My phone was already complaining, no bars, not even a flicker. I tried moving from window to window to catch a signal and finally got one shaky bar long enough to send my brother a text saying I'd made it. I stood at the sink to eat a cold sandwich, looking out the window into the trees. The trunks were packed so close together, they looked like a single black wall. It was the same feeling I'd had as a kid, like if you stared too long, something might blink back at you. That night, I turned in early. There wasn't much else to do. No TV, no internet, just the old clock ticking in the hallway. I lay on the sagging mattress, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house creak and settle. Every sound seemed too loud. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. At first I thought it was nothing, just the usual pops and groans of an old place cooling off. But then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate scraping right under the floorboards. I froze. My heartbeat thumped in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a possum rooting around under there. But the sound was too measured, too steady, like fingers testing the wood grain, moving back and forth. The scraping paused, then came this dull thud, like a hand pressing flat against the underside of the floor, feeling for weak spots. I lay there with my fist clenched against the blankets, every muscle locked up. My mouth felt too dry to swallow. The noises went on like that for what felt like an hour, scraping, pausing, pressing over and over. When it finally stopped, I didn't move. I stayed there until the first hint of dawn slipped around the curtains. In the daylight, everything looked normal again. I forced myself to go outside and check the crawlspace vents. Nothing was disturbed, no footprints, no scratches. I told myself I was overtired, maybe still half dreaming. I kept packing all day, but I couldn't stop thinking about that hatch in the kitchen floor, the one that led under the house. Every time I walked past it, I felt this tight little knot under my ribs. Like if I looked too long, I'd see it cracked open. The second night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. At first, I just lay there with the blankets pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling. Hours passed without a single noise. Eventually, my eyes started to droop. Then, just after midnight, the scraping started again. It was closer this time. I heard it moving along the floor, stopping every few feet. The boards under my bed creaked. I felt my pulse slam against my ribs. My breath was coming in these shallow little gasps I couldn't control. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, like it was testing each plank, searching for the thinnest part. I fumbled for my phone. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. No signal, not even the one bar that flickered in the day. The noise stopped. For a second, there was total silence. Then I heard a voice, low and muffled, coming from right below me. The words were impossible to understand. Just this wet, rasping shape of speech, like someone trying to whisper through a mouthful of mud. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag, swung my legs over the side of the mattress, and ran. At the top of the stairs, I stopped. The hatch in the kitchen was creaking open. It lifted slowly like whatever was underneath was careful not to make too much noise. I could see something pale rising through the gap, a bare shoulder streaked with dirt, an arm long and thin reaching for the floor. I didn't wait. I bolted down the stairs so fast my feet slipped on the runner. I hit the front door, shoved it open, and sprinted across the clearing. My breath was ragged in my throat. The grass was wet and clung to my ankles. I didn't care. I just kept running until I reached the trees. I pressed my back against the rough bark of an oak, trying to make my hands work the phone again. Nothing. I crouched there, holding my breath for a few seconds. Everything went still. Then I heard the front door swing open. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, moved down the porch steps into the yard. They paused, then shifted closer, like whoever it was could feel me nearby, but hadn't pinned down exactly where I was hiding. I pressed my cheek against the bark and stayed perfectly still. My heart was hammering so loud, I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps wandered through the grass, stopping every so often. I thought I heard breathing, wet, labored. Eventually, the steps drifted to the far edge of the clearing. I didn't move until the sky started to pale. When there was enough light to see, I crept back across the yard. My legs felt hollow. The front door was wide open. Inside, the hatch was closed again. Neat as you please. I didn't care what I left behind. I packed what I could reach without going upstairs, walked straight out, and drove until the trees fell away behind me. Story 2. The year I was 26, my cousin Mason decided that we should go hiking way out near Fox Hollow. You might assume that growing up in eastern Kentucky, by the time we were old enough to drive, we'd have explored every ridge and holler, but somehow, neither of us had ever tried going that deep into the woods. And honestly, I never planned to. Everyone in our county knew the stories about that place. My granddad used to sit on the back porch drinking sweet tea and telling me about hunters who'd gone up the old service trails and never come back. People found their gear or their trucks days later, but not a single track past the last trail marker. He always said those ridges swallowed folks whole, and the way he looked at the trees when he said, it made me feel like he knew something he wasn't sharing. Mason was never one to care about old stories. He had this attitude that if he hadn't seen it himself, it couldn't possibly be real. He'd laugh off any warning, no matter how serious, and start talking about how people just made up ghost tales to keep kids from trespassing. This time, he'd gotten it into his head that he needed to camp somewhere. The map goes blank, as he put it. No cell signal, no roads, no signs, just a bunch of old growth trees and a sense of self-satisfaction. I told him more than once it was a bad plan, but the truth is I didn't want him thinking I was scared. You spend enough years trying not to look weak in front of someone. It gets hard to draw the line at common sense. So that's how we ended up in Mason's truck, bouncing over potholes toward a rusted-out gate that hadn't been chained in decades. I remember he tapped the horn like we were driving up to a buddy's house, then climbed out to kick the gate open. The hinges made this awful grinding noise, like a scream in slow motion. He thought that was hilarious. Or we parked in a patch of gravel that looked like it hadn't seen a vehicle in years. When I climbed out, the air smelled musty. almost metallic, like old leaves and something else I couldn't name. I tried to ignore it while we loaded up our packs. The first couple miles felt normal enough. It was early September and everything was still green. The trail started wide and obvious, just an old service road with tire ruts that had filled with rainwater. I kept waiting to see another hiker, but the only signs of life were birds flicking through the branches. Mason looked back at me once and remarked that it felt like we'd stepped out of time, like the world had ended behind us, and we hadn't noticed yet. He had a way of saying things that sounded poetic when he wanted them to. Every mile or two, we passed some trace of the people who'd lived up there a century ago. Stone chimneys standing alone, piles of broken bottles half buried in dirt, a cast iron stove rusting away in a thicket of honeysuckle. I caught myself wondering about those families, if they'd left willingly, or if something had driven them out. We set up camp that first night by a shallow creek. Mason made a fire with a little pyramid of twigs and a spark wheel he'd bought off the internet. He bragged about how you didn't need matches if you were prepared. Personally, I thought it would have been easier to bring a lighter, but I kept that opinion to myself. I tried to focus on cooking noodles and not on the sense that something was just past the trees watching us. My skin felt prickly, like it does when you wake up from a nightmare you can't remember. Mason didn't notice. He was too busy ranting about all the camping videos he'd watched, as if YouTube could protect us from whatever was out there. That night, I lay awake long after he started snoring. The fire had burned down to embers, and the trees around us looked like they were closing in every time I blinked. I'd hear leaves crunch soft and slow like footsteps, trying not to be footsteps. Then, I'd hold my breath, and it would stop, over and over until I was half convinced I was imagining it. I must have slept eventually, because when I woke up, the light was thin and gray. We packed up without saying much. I think Mason was hoping I wouldn't bring up how uneasy I'd looked the night before. The second day, the trail turned into little more than a deer path. You had to pick your way between fallen limbs and watch for holes in the ground where old fence posts had rotted away. Around midday, Mason spotted a sign nailed high up on a poplar. The wood was splintered, the paint so faded it looked almost white, but I could still make out 3 words. No return trail. He laughed, said it had to be somebody's idea of a prank. I didn't answer him. I was too busy trying not to think about what kind of person would hike this far just to nail up a warning. Later, we stopped on this rocky bluff to eat. The slope fell away so steep, I could barely see the bottom. I just started unwrapping a protein bar when I noticed something moving between the trees down there. At first, I thought it was an elk, pale, tall, gliding across the gully without a sound. Then it stood up straighter. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees. It turned its head in this slow, methodical way, like it was counting every tree. When it tipped its face toward the sky, I saw the way its jaw split up the middle and fell open. I didn't breathe. My hands clenched so tight on the protein bar the wrapper tore in 2. For a minute, I thought I'd throw up right there, but then it stepped behind a thicket of saplings and vanished. And all I could do was sit there staring. Mason finally noticed how I looked and asked if I was sick. I tried to speak, but my throat felt glued shut. I nodded just to get him to stop looking at me. We didn't talk much after that. I think he could tell something had changed. That night, we camped in a hollow barely big enough to fit both our tents. We didn't make a fire. I didn't want anything seeing where we were. I lay in the dark counting every whip will call. The space between them started to stretch and my stomach sank. When the call stopped altogether, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then a voice drifted out of the trees. At first, it was just a low mumble, too soft to catch the words, but it grew clearer and I felt every hair on my arm stand up. It was my mother's voice, the same soft tone she'd used when I was a kid, afraid of the dark. "Cowan," it said. My chest went hollow. My brain kept trying to find some explanation, maybe a trick of the wind or my imagination playing back old memories, but it was her, down to the little tremble in her vowels. I turned to shake Mason awake. My hand hit nothing but cold nylon. His sleeping bag was empty. I scrambled out of the tent so fast I nearly fell on my face. My flashlight fumbled in my grip. I sucked in a lungful of cold, musty air and called his name. The trees swallowed my voice. Then I heard her again, farther down slope, and part of me wanted to run toward it. Like maybe if I did, I'd find her sitting there smiling, waiting to hug me. But something deeper, older, kept me frozen. I turned in a slow circle with the light. That's when I saw it, about 20 yards away, half hidden behind a black oak. It stood watching me. Its skin looked slick, stretched too thin over bones that didn't fit right. Long arms hung slack, fingers brushing the leaves. Its chest rose and fell, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see any eyes. That was the worst part. If I'd seen eyes, maybe I could have looked away. It shifted, sliding sideways around the trunk, shoulders twisting in a way no person's ever could. It circled slow and patient, like it knew I couldn't decide whether to run or stay rooted. I stumbled back and caught my shin on a rock. My flashlight beam jittered over the trees. That's when I saw a second one, just a flicker of pale skin between trunks. That did it. I bolted. I crashed through brambles and over deadfall, branches whipping my face and arms. My heart felt like it was going to tear out of my ribs. Behind me, voices rose up. First my mother's, then Mason's, then my own. All of them calling my name in different pitches. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. The dark blurred everything, but the thought, don't stop. Just keep going. When I finally hit the old service road, the sky was starting to rise. My legs buckled. I dropped in the dirt and lay there, panting so hard my throat burned. Later, a Forest Service truck rolled up. The ranger climbed out slow, like he was afraid he'd startle me. He helped me into the cab, gave me water, and tried not to look too worried. When he asked where Mason was, I couldn't answer. I just shook my head. I didn't tell him what I saw. He would have believed me if I had. Story 3. I grew up in this tiny patch of southern Missouri that most folks would miss if they blinked driving through. I spent most of my 20s telling myself I was done with it. I'd moved to St. Louis, got a job that didn't require boots, and tried to convince myself I'd never have to come back except for... But last October, my Uncle Randall passed, so I drove back mostly out of obligation. After the funeral, this small, quiet service in a brick church that smelled like lemon oil and old windows, I walked out into the parking lot and just stood there with my hands in my pockets, feeling like something was stuck under my ribs. I couldn't tell if it was grief or if it was something older, something I'd carried with me since I was a kid and never shook loose. That Sunday afternoon, I packed a rucksack. Nothing fancy, just a tarp, my old sleeping bag, a couple of protein bars, and the hunting knife I'd had since I was 17. It still had my initials scratched into the handle from the day I got it. I filled my thermos with whatever coffee was left in the pot at the gas station and drove out to this trail I'd only ever heard people talk about after a couple drinks. Folks called it Jasper Bend. Supposedly way back in the 1800s, a group of loggers disappeared there. Some people said it was a rock slide. Others swore it was something they couldn't explain. You'd hear the stories if you hung around the VFW long enough, but nobody agreed on what actually happened. All I really knew was nobody bothered to keep it cleared, and you could hike out there for days and never run into anybody. I think that's what I wanted to be, alone. By the time I turned off onto the gravel shoulder, the sun was already sinking behind the ridge. There was this rusted-out gate hanging on one hinge, and a wooden sign so weathered the letters were just shallow grooves you could barely read if you squinted. For a second, I thought about turning around. I could have driven back to town, slept in the guest room at my mom's, tried to act normal, but the quiet out there felt like the only thing I had left that might help. So I killed the engine, locked the truck, and started down the trail. It wasn't much of a trail, if I'm honest, just a narrow crease through the underbrush, choked with brambles and old fallen branches. Every so often, the ground would dip away into these sudden gullies carved by runoff, over who knows how many years. I slipped once, caught myself on a route that felt damp and soft, and when I looked up, I could see the ridge through a mess of bare branches. It struck me right then how easy it would be to vanish out there, how a person could just step wrong and disappear, and nobody would ever know exactly where they'd gone. About a mile in, I came across what must have been an old fence line. The boards were collapsed, half buried in the dirt, like the earth was trying to swallow them. Just past it, there was a clearing, probably no bigger than my kitchen, circled by stones that looked like the last scraps of a foundation. Right in the middle, a crooked sapling was growing out of a shallow pit. I don't know why, but seeing it made my mouth go dry, like I'd swallowed sand. I skirted around it without stepping closer. The light was almost gone by the time the trail curved down toward the river. The water was so low, it looked more like a line of wet rocks than a real stream. I found a flat spot under the bluff where the ground seemed dry enough, even if it felt a little too close to the water for comfort. My boots left these dark prints in the silt, and for a second, I just stood there listening. When I bent to set my pack down, that's when I saw them. Footprints coming up behind me. They were faint, almost smudged into the dirt like they'd been left, when the ground was still damp from rain. What got me was how narrow they were, too narrow for an adult, and some were so far apart that whoever made them must have been jumping or walking in a way I couldn't picture. My stomach twisted, but I told myself, maybe they were old, weeks old, maybe longer. I forced myself to keep moving. I built a little fire, sat close enough that I could feel the heat on my face, and pulled out a paperback I brought. I read the same page 3 times without taking in a word. That was when I heard it, this low 2 whistle drifting down the slope. The sound was too clean, too deliberate. I held my breath, waiting. A few seconds later, it came again. The same notes, the same pause afterward, like whoever made it was listening for something. My mouth felt dry as chalk. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded too thin, like it didn't belong to me. Nothing answered. I waited until the fire burned down to coals. The whistle didn't come back, but the silence felt worse somehow, like everything out there was holding its breath. Eventually, I let the fire go to embers and crawled into my tent. I didn't zip it all the way. I lay on my back with the knife handle resting across my chest, staring at the fabric overhead. My shoulders were so tense they hurt. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up hours later with my heart hammering so hard, it felt like it might bruise my ribs. I stayed completely still, listening. That's when I heard it. A slow crunch of leaves, one careful step at a time. It was close, maybe 10 feet away, moving around the edge of the bluff. I waited, hoping whatever it was would keep going, but the step stopped right outside my tent. The air felt like it had thickened somehow, pressing down on me. Then something pressed against the nylon, just one finger tracing the curve of the fabric above my knee. My jaw clenched so tight I felt my teeth ache. The finger moved again, slower, feeling the shape of my leg. Shut my eyes. I didn't breathe. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Finally, the pressure lifted. I heard the steps again, moving away, deliberate, careful, until the sound faded into the trees. I didn't move until the first gray light slid over the ridge. When I finally crawled out, my hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped the knife. There weren't any tracks, no broken branches, nothing that showed anyone had been there. I tore the camp down in minutes. My pack was a mess, scours trailing, tarp half unrolled. But I didn't care. I needed to be moving. I didn't stop to eat or drink. I just walked, my head down, the strap digging into the same spot on my shoulder until I felt like it might cut through skin. Every step made my jaw clench tighter. When I finally reached the trailhead, I could see my truck through the trees. Relief hit me so fast my knees almost buckled. I stumbled into the clearing and stopped. Something was propped against the driver's side door. It was a strip of pale bark curled up at the edges. Someone had carved a shape into it. Long legs, an oval head, no arms, just that blank silhouette. Story 4. I grew up in a little town called Elkford. You probably haven't heard of it. It's basically a scatter of houses jammed into a fold of the Allegheny foothills. No stoplights, no gas station, just a bait shop that sells coffee so stale it tastes like burnt cardboard. House. I ended up staying in, belonged to my uncle. Everyone called it the place out by Nolan's Hollow, as if that explained everything. It was this narrow 2-story thing built out of wood so old it had gone gray. The foundation was stacked stone, some of it cracked so wide you could lose your keys in the gaps. For most of my life, I only ever visited on Thanksgiving, and even then I didn't like staying past sundown. But last December, after everything in my life went sideways, I decided I'd move in for a while. I kept telling myself it was temporary, just a break to get my head straight, figure out what came next. My girlfriend had left the month before, my hours at the mechanic shop got cut, and my mom kept calling to ask if I was managing okay, which really meant she thought I was falling apart. Probably wasn't wrong. So I loaded up my truck with a mattress, a couple boxes of books, some clothes, and drove out there in the middle of a freezing rainstorm. The first few weeks weren't so bad. The days were quiet. I'd split wood out by the shed, patch the worst of the drafty spots, and sit on the porch with coffee that tasted about as bad as the bait shops. At night, though, the house had a way of reminding me I was alone. The beams would crack sometimes in these slow popping sounds that made me imagine someone pacing overhead. I tried not to think too hard about it. I kept the generator fueled and the propane tanks lined up in the mudroom. It just felt smarter to be prepared. And yeah, I had a revolver in a little lockbox by the bed. Not because I thought I'd need it, but everyone in Elkford acted like it was common sense. Out here, you didn't assume you were safe just because you locked the door. That night started out the same as any other. I made some instant noodles, tasted about as good as warm glue, read an old paperback I had already been through twice, and did the usual circuit to check the doors and windows. I'd gotten into this habit of double-checking the deadbolts before I turned in. I guess part of me needed to see the locks engaged to believe they'd keep anything out. It must have been around 10 when I heard the first noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft scraping, like something thin getting dragged across the porch. For a second, I didn't even look up from my book. There were so many animals around, half-feral cats and raccoons that would climb up on the railings. But then it came again, longer this time. A dry, papery sound that ended with 3 little taps against the door. I put my book down, spine up on the coffee table, and walked over to the window by the door. The porch looked empty. The old rocking chair sat perfectly still, not even a twitch. I cracked the door open an inch, and a rush of cold air hit me in the face. It smelled damp and a little sour, like wet leaves left to rot. I leaned out just far enough to look left and right. Nothing moved, no footprints, no sign of anyone. I shut the door and locked it again. My shoulders were tight, like I was waiting for something to lunge out of the dark and grab me. I switched off the lamp and sat back down. My eyes adjusted slowly. Shapes emerged: the couch, the stack of firewood, the little glow from the generator light in the kitchen. I kept telling myself it was just some animal. Maybe a possum, maybe a branch fallen against the siding. But then, right before midnight came the knock. 3 short raps. Calm, like whoever was out there didn't feel the need to hurry. I stood so fast the book fell off the table and hit the floor with a smack. I didn't call out, didn't ask who it was, just walked over, rested my palm flat against the door. The wood was cold, almost wet. Hello? Nothing? Not a shuffle of feet, not even the creak of the porch boards. I leaned into the peephole. The porch was exactly the same, empty. I stepped back, locked the door again for good measure. My heart was beating so hard I felt a little lightheaded, like I just sprinted a mile. I went back to my chair, but this time I picked up the revolver and laid it across my knees. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. This was an old house alone in the woods. Nothing unusual about creaks and knocks. An hour passed. I didn't move. Eventually the adrenaline started to wear off. My arms went numb from holding still so long. Part of me started to think it was over, that whatever it was had given up and left. I stood up to stretch my back. My legs felt stiff and clumsy. I thought maybe I'd go upstairs, make sure the windows were locked, and try to get some sleep. That's when I heard it. Footsteps upstairs. Not just a random creak. Actual footsteps. Slow and steady, moving from the end of the hall to the top of the stairs. I froze. Revolver clutched so tight my knuckles ached. I waited, hoping it would stop. But the steps came again, heavier this time. Crossing back toward the spare room, turned the lamp on. The circle of light made everything look flat and washed out. My hand went to the lockbox just out of habit. That's when I saw it was already open. I'd forgotten to close it after cleaning the revolver last week. I checked the cylinder, loaded, and walked over to the base of the stairs. Anyone up there? No reply. I took the first step. It groaned under my weight. The footsteps started again. Back and forth, deliberate like they wanted me to hear. I climbed to the landing, every step feeling harder than the last. My uncle's old bedroom door was cracked open an inch. I raised the gun. My free hand found the switch on the wall. I flicked it up. Nothing. The bulb had been working that afternoon. I pushed the door open with my shoulder. The room was empty. Bare mattress, empty dresser drawers, the window locked. I backed out slowly, trying not to blink. I closed the door and turned toward my bedroom. That's when I heard it. A whisper coming from the other side of my door. It was this thin, papery voice repeating the same string of words in a language I'd never heard. I inched closer, revolver trembling in my hand. I pressed my ear to the door, felt my pulse hammering against the wood. I took a breath that felt too shallow to do anything, and swung the door open. Silence. The room looked exactly the same. My unmade bed, my duffel bag propped against the closet. Then, from the corner of my eye, something moved. A shape slipped along the wall, tall, thin, wrapped in something that looked like it belonged in the ground. I jerked the revolver up, finger pressing the trigger, but before I could squeeze it, the shape was gone, sliding out the door. I backed up so fast I hit the dresser. I didn't think I turned and ran down the stairs out the door across the yard. My boots skidded on the gravel, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I reached the bend where the trees opened up to the road. I stopped there, bent over, gasping so hard it felt like my ribs might snap. My throat tasted metallic, like blood. I turned back. The house stood there, perfectly still. I waited there until sunrise and never went back.